Something amazing was going to occur in the Holy Land in the year 1177 among the dry hills close to the city of Ramler. An incident that would break all the rules of medieval warfare, devastate even the most experienced military planners, and demonstrate that sometimes the most resolute people, not the biggest armies, write history. This is how the Battle of Montgisard came to be. Few people are aware of this conflict, but it altered the trajectory of the Crusades and exposed a hidden weapon that could have destroyed one of the biggest armies ever gathered in the Middle East during the Middle Ages. Take a moment to picture the situation. The Crusades are at their height in the 12th century. Rivalries, shaky alliances, and imperial aspirations abound in the Holy Land. The Crusader states are divided and under continual threat on one side. On the other hand, a new Muslim leader is gaining strength and is ready to unite the Islamic world under his leadership. This individual is Saladin Yusuf Nayub, also referred to as Saladin in the West. His name is already starting to inspire optimism among Muslims and terror among Christians. In addition to being intelligent and ambitious, he is adamant about driving the Crusaders out of the Holy Land. But we must first comprehend the political and military circumstances that led to this encounter before we can discuss the actual war. The Crusader powers maintained a tenuous presence in the Levant since the First Crusade, which ended with the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099. In essence, these kingdoms were Christian islands amid a Muslim sea. The Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa created a defensive chain that relied on divisions among its adversaries as well as powerful defenses. This tactic worked fairly effectively for decades. In many cases, Muslim leaders were more interested in battling one another than in banding together to repel the European invaders. However, when Nuruddin, the Atabeg of Aleppo, started a unification project that would last after his passing, everything started to shift. Who would be the heir of this project? Specifically, Saladin. Following Nuruddin's death in 1174, Saladin acted swiftly to unite Egypt and Syria into a single force that was the biggest threat to the Crusader states since their establishment. Let us now focus on the rulers of this crucial kingdom in 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Baldwin IV is one of the Crusades' most tragic and intriguing characters. Baldwin was not your typical monarch. At 13, he was crowned, and he was facing the death penalty even at that young age. Baldwin had leprosy, which gradually weakened the body and was thought to be a heavenly curse at the time. But don't be misled. Even his adversaries were impressed with Baldwin's bravery and keen strategic thinking, despite his failing physical state. The struggle of his life was about to be faced by this young king whose life itself was being consumed by the sickness. Remember to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment on when you watched this video if you're enjoying this historical stuff. The channel will expand and be able to provide you with more amazing stories like this one thanks to your participation. Saladin gathered a sizable army in October 1177 with the bold and obvious goal of invading the Kingdom of Jerusalem and possibly taking the Holy City. The most trustworthy estimates place his force size at around 26,000 soldiers, though historical accounts differ on this point. For comparison, this was a huge army by medieval proportions. It was an army made up of seasoned infantry, mounted archers, elite Mamluk cavalry, and soldiers from various regions that Saladin ruled. A lot of logistical work had gone into assembling this army, which included contingents from Syria, Egypt, and other places. It was an obvious message. The Crusaders were unable to match Saladin's might and capacity for mobilizing resources. Saladin had a cunning plan.
He knew that the military might of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was widely dispersed. Baldwin had dispatched a sizable force to the north to assist in protecting other Crusader areas from danger. The kingdom's center became exposed as a result. Saladin intended to strike quickly and with overwhelming force, destroying the area before the Crusaders could respond. After crossing the border, his men started to ruthlessly pillage the coastal area, approaching Ascalon, a key Crusader stronghold on the southern coast, in peril. Even though he was young and physically weak, Baldwin saw the seriousness of the situation right away. When he heard of Saladin's invasion, he had a small garrison in Ascalon. Baldwin was in a bad situation. Only roughly 500 knights were directly under his command. This number would be increased by a few hundred foot soldiers and archers, making it a force of fewer than 1,000 fighters. With such few resources, how can you contend with an army that is 26 times larger? The obvious response would be to not fight. Any sensible commander would have waited, sent out urgent calls for reinforcements, and established himself in Ascalon. Baldwin, however, was no typical leader. Here we must comprehend the military mindset of the Middle Ages, particularly that of the Knights of the Military Orders. Baldwin had access to a group of Knights Templar under the command of the Grand Master of the Ord, Odo of St. Amand. In all of Christendom, the Templars were one of the most orderly and feared military groups. Established decades ago with pilgrim protection in mind, they had developed into an elite military force with first-rate weapons, outstanding training, and most importantly, an unwavering faith that gave them the courage to fight. Death was not a fear of the Templars. They accepted it as a potential route to everlasting redemption and martyrdom. Baldwin's scouts provided him with important information. Saladin had let his army spread out across the area to maximize looting and destruction, since he was sure of his numerical superiority and seemed to be certain that Baldwin would not dare leave Ascalon. This was a typical tactical mistake. A commander develops weaknesses when he grows overconfident and believes the enemy will operate in a predictable manner. There was no combat formation among Saladin's forces. They were dispersed, occupied with gathering supplies and pillaging villages. With the assurance that there would not be an immediate conflict, several soldiers were even taking a nap. There was a limited window of opportunity for Baldwin. Perhaps, just possibly, he could cause enough damage to compel a retreat if he could rapidly gather his forces and launch an attack before Saladin regrouped his dispersed army. However, there was a serious logistical issue. Saladin's army was located at a region called Montgisard, close to Ramla, while Baldwin's men were at Ascalon. Baldwin had to shift his forces quickly and covertly, which was an incredible task in and of itself. The choice was made. Baldwin made the decision to march to meet Saladin with the Templars and the Bishop of Bethlehem, who was carrying the most revered relic in the kingdom, a piece of the real cross. The real cross represented more than just religion. It was regarded as a source of divine power that might give those who fought beneath its protection success. In medieval understanding, the existence of this relic transformed the upcoming conflict from a military conflict to a holy war, an existential conflict between good and evil. Baldwin's march was a masterful demonstration of strategic mobility. By moving swiftly and utilizing their local knowledge of the terrain, his soldiers managed to stay undetected. Each hour was crucial. Saladin might simply reorganize his forces and destroy the tiny Crusader force before it could even organize for combat. However, Baldwin had luck, or, as the Crusaders held, divine providence. He was able to place his troops without being seen. Let's now take a moment to think about what Saladin was thinking at the time. He was at the pinnacle of an effective campaign. Without any resistance, his forces had decimated enemy territory.
The locals were afraid. They were collecting riches. Everything suggested that the Crusader states would be further weakened by this further display of power. Even the most seasoned leaders can be caught off guard when they underestimate their adversary, as Saladin did, or let early success lead to complacency. Baldwin's army eventually overtook Saladin's army in Montgisard on November 25, 1177. It was a typical landscape for the area. Dusty trails meandered between tiny climbs in low hills and partly open landscape with little flora. Naturally, Saladin's army was dispersed. While some units were busy collecting loot, others patrolled languidly, while yet others were camping. There was no proper military formation. Baldwin convened a quick council of war with his commanders. The plan would be straightforward, yet dangerous. They would launch a full-scale assault, focusing their strikes on what seemed to be the heart of Saladin's camp, where the Muslim leader was stationed. The plan was to inflict as much shock and bewilderment as possible, decapitate the commanders of the enemy army if at all possible, and instill enough fear that Saladin's dispersed forces would be unable to organize a successful defense. It was a strategy of all or nothing. The Kingdom of Jerusalem would suffer a devastating blow if it failed, losing both its monarch and its finest soldiers. The Templars took their place in the lead. The most destructive formation of medieval cavalry was the charging wedge, which was created by these knights wearing full armor and white cloaks emblazoned with the Red Cross. Despite his physical limitations due to leprosy, Baldwin himself mounted his warhorse behind them. The real cross was raised by the Bethlehem bishop, and everyone there realized at that same instant that they were engaged in more than just a territorial or political struggle. They sincerely thought they were defending God's will, their survival, and their faith. They gave the signal. The assault started. Imagine the thunder of hooves on the parched ground, the stream of armor, the roar of a knight's battle cry resonating through the hills, and hundreds of horses galloping at once. Crusader cavalry served as a psychological as well as a physical weapon. In terms of physical force and demoralizing effect, the impact of a large cavalry charge in the Middle Ages was similar to that of a modern tank. Saladin's army's initial units were caught entirely off guard. Suddenly, soldiers who were sleeping, eating, or arranging supplies were confronted by armored riders galloping at full speed. The first shock was severe. The battle horses trampled entire lines of men. Spears pierced them. The panic sprang up like wildfire. When Saladin realized the onslaught, he made a last-ditch effort to plan a defense. His leadership was put to the greatest test in this situation. A weaker commander would have screamed and ran for cover. Saladin, on the other hand, was tougher. He started yelling commands in an attempt to unite his dispersed soldiers, creating pockets of opposition around his most seasoned leaders and his elite army of Mamluk cavalry battalions. The awful reality of medieval warfare is as follows. It is nearly impossible to bring order back to a dispersed army once panic has set in. When soldiers were separated from their normal units, they were unsure of who to follow and where to go. There was complete bewilderment. Some parties were outflanked and massacred when they attempted to establish defensive lines. Others just started to run, and in a battlefield, running is infectious. The Crusaders' bravery and military prowess were not the only hidden weapon decimating Saladin's army. It was something deeper, the deadly fusion of ruthless exploitation of an enemy's strategic blunder, tactical surprise, speed of execution, and force concentration at the crucial moment. Assuming that his army's numerical strength shielded it from any danger, Saladin had committed the grave mistake of permitting it to spread out into possibly hostile terrain. Baldwin had recognized this weakness and skillfully took advantage of it. Saladin found himself in a more dire predicament as the war went on.
The Crusader attack's speed and ferocity repeatedly prevented his attempts to muster enough troops to launch a successful counterattack. The Muslim soldiers believed that the Templars in particular fought with an intensity that verged on the uncanny. These were not your typical fighters. They were indoctrinated fanatics who fought until they were exhausted or killed, refusing to back down or surrender. When Saladin was attempting to organize his defense in the middle of the battlefield, a number of Templars successfully fought their way there, marking a turning moment. Saladin himself was for a horrifying instant in grave danger. According to modern reports, he barely avoided death, perhaps thanks to the efforts of his personal guard, who gave their lives to free their master. This was a pivotal moment. The last organized resistance started to disintegrate as the warriors realized that even the great Saladin was in danger and would have to flee. What came next was a vicious chase. Now that the momentum was entirely in their favor, the Crusader troops pursued Saladin's fleeing army for miles. In many respects, this stage of the conflict was more deadly than the first one. Soldiers on the run are easy targets. They are prone to attacks from behind, are unable to defend themselves effectively, and frequently drop armor and weapons in order to escape more quickly. Carnage ensued as the Crusader cavalry repeatedly sliced into the retreating columns. By today's standards, the Battle of Montgisard's final toll is horrifying and astounding. About 90% of Saladin's army is thought to have been lost. Only maybe 2,000 or 3,000 of the 26,000 guys were able to get away. One among the survivors was Saladin. However, his escape was embarrassing. He had to leave his army, his supplies, and his invasion plans behind and ride swiftly to Egypt with only a few guards. It was his career's most devastating loss. The Crusader side suffered relatively minor but nonetheless notable casualties. Hundreds of infantrymen and perhaps a dozen knights were slain or injured. However, these losses were negligible in the context of the numerical difference. Baldwin had accomplished the unthinkable. He had defeated an army more than 20 times greater with fewer than 1,000 troops. Let's examine what actually transpired in Montgisard in more detail, though. After all, what was the covert weapon that made this remarkable triumph possible? The answer is complicated because there was more than one hidden weapon. Rather, a number of events combined to produce the ideal circumstances for an improbable victory. Intelligence and reconnaissance come first. Baldwin's knowledge of Saladin's army's dispersion was true. He would never have taken the chance of the attack if he had not known this. This emphasizes how crucial military intelligence is. Understanding the opponent, their attitude, and their level of preparedness might be just as important as the quantity of troops on the battlefield. The second is the rate of movement and mobilization. With remarkable speed, Baldwin's forces traveled great distances without being seen. This swift and covert troop movement is a crucial strategic advantage. Many fights are decided by the maneuver that comes before the clash rather than by the actual conflict. Tactical surprise comes third. Saladin did not anticipate being assaulted, particularly by a force of that size. He was unable to adequately plan his case because of this surprise. In combat, surprise can counteract severe numerical disadvantages by acting as a force multiplier. Fourth, the quality of troops. Professional soldiers with superior equipment, discipline, and training were the Templar and Crusader knights. A properly equipped and trained Templar knight could easily defeat a number of less prepared opponents in close combat. The fifth is leadership. Baldwin showed remarkable leadership in spite of his youth and infirmity. He took a risk, carried it out precisely, and motivated his soldiers to fight harder than they usually would have. At a pivotal point, leadership can mean the difference between success and failure. The psychological component comes in sixth.
The Crusaders' commitment and morale were so strong because of the authentic cross and their sincere conviction that they were engaged in a holy war, that it overpowered the will of their adversaries. Never undervalue the influence of motive and belief in armed warfare. The seventh, and possibly most significant, was Saladin's strategic miscalculation. Baldwin took advantage of the weakness he created by deciding to scatter his soldiers. A disorganized and fragmented army is weaker than even the best. In his overconfidence, Saladin momentarily overlooked a basic precept of warfare: concentration of power at the decisive point. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Battle of Montgisard had significant and long-lasting effects. It was a literal salvation. The kingdom might have collapsed decades sooner than it did in the past if Saladin had been successful in his invasion. The Crusaders had valuable time to regroup their forces and strengthen their defenses as a result of the victory. Additionally, it greatly enhanced Baldwin's reputation. A monarch who was widely viewed as feeble because of his illness turned out to be a bright and brave military leader. Montgisard was a difficult but necessary learning experience for Saladin. He would never again undervalue his opponents in the crusade. He became more cautious and methodical in his planning as a result of the defeat, but it didn't break him. Saladin had tenacity. He went back to Egypt, reorganized his army, and carried on with his efforts to bring the Muslim world together. His aspirations did not stop with the defeat at Montgisard. Rather, it was a setback. Considering how this fight influenced later events is fascinating. Saladin and Baldwin would clash more times in the ensuing years. Despite their political and religious animosity, they respected one another. Baldwin acknowledged Saladin's competence and honor, while Saladin reportedly praised Baldwin's bravery. Medieval warfare was paradoxical in this way. On the battlefield, mortal adversaries were able to identify one another's traits. Following Montgisard, Baldwin's health continued to decline. His physique was gradually destroyed by leprosy. Despite becoming blind and losing the ability to use his hands and legs, he ruled until his death in 1185 by pure willpower. He continued to be a source of inspiration and authority for his kingdom, despite his frail state. His passing created a leadership void that fueled the internal strife that ultimately weakened the Crusader states.
10 years after Montgisard, Saladin would accomplish his ultimate objective. He dealt the Crusaders a defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 that was just as terrible as the one he had at Montgisard. Montgisard was the complete antithesis of Hattin. Superior Muslim soldiers decimated a small Crusader army that was outnumbered and outmatched strategically. Following Hattin, the Crusader states would experience a period of decline from which they would never fully recover, and Jerusalem would fall. Here's the interesting question we need to think about, though. The history of the Crusades would have been entirely different if Saladin had been successful in 1177 and Montgisard had not occurred. 10 years ago, Jerusalem might have fallen. It's possible that the Crusader states would have fallen sooner. It's possible that Richard the Lionheart's Third Crusade might never have taken place as it did. Decades of history were changed by one war, a pivotal event. This is the strength and peril of war. Actions taken in hours and decisions made in seconds can have far-reaching effects that span generations. We learn from Montgisard that in a military fight, numbers are not everything. That overconfidence is a deadly peril, even for the most brilliant commander, and that morale, timing, leadership, and strategy can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. That audacity must be restrained with proper forethought, but that luck favors the brave. We can also gain insight into the medieval thinking through the Battle of Montgisard. This conflict was more than a struggle for political dominance or territory for the players. It was a cosmic conflict between right and wrong, between good and evil.
The incredible willingness of medieval combatants to risk all in battle was a result of this worldview, which was considerably different from the secular modern outlook. They truly thought they were battling for their everlasting soul's salvation, not merely for kings and kingdoms. Montgisard provides practical military teachings that are still applicable in today's conflicts. Accurate intelligence is crucial, initiative is advantageous, surprise is valuable, dispersing forces is dangerous, and organization and discipline must be maintained even during offensive operations. These are general military combat facts that cut beyond error and technology. Think about the function of personal leadership as well. Before the invention of modern communications, commands were conveyed by visual signals or mounted messengers, and coordination was very challenging due to the tumult of combat. The leader's actual presence was essential. Baldwin didn't give orders from a distance. On the battlefield, he was there, visible to his soldiers and aware of their risks. This personal leadership served as a strong source of inspiration. Knowing that their commander is on the same side as them and taking the same risks makes soldiers fight harder. Another outstanding quality of Montgisard is his ability to remain disciplined under tremendous pressure. In particular, the Templars showed remarkable control. They remained in line and obeyed commands even when the battle was intense and victory was imminent. They were able to limit their own losses and enhance their effect because to this discipline. Even successful armies that lack discipline frequently sustain needless casualties as a result of soldiers pursuing individual glory or looting instead of keeping tactical formation. Although not as spectacular as actual fighting, logistics were equally important. Baldwin needed to make sure his soldiers had enough supplies for the quick advance on Montgisard. It was necessary to feed horses and maintain their packability. Weapons and armor had to be functional.
The success or failure of military campaigns is frequently determined by these unimportant aspects. No matter how valiant, an army that is malnourished or ill-prepared is at a serious disadvantage. The war was also impacted by geography. Because of the vast spaces and low slopes in the vicinity of Montgisard, heavy cavalry was used. The Crusader knights' tactical advantages would have been greatly diminished if the conflict had been fought on a more mountainous terrain or in an area that was heavily forested. In order to select battlefields that benefit their own forces, competent commanders always take into account how the terrain will impact military operations. It's also interesting that the conflict took place in late November. At this time of year, the Holy Land experiences a typically temperate climate that avoids both the intense summer heat and the winter rains. This made it possible to move troops quickly without having to deal with bad weather. Weather conditions may have hindered Baldwin's response or Saladin's campaign at other times of the year. The psychological effects of the conflict on both sides' survivors must also be taken into account. For decades to come, the Crusader warriors would tell the tale of Montgisard's valor and divine intervention. It strengthened their conviction that God was with them, that miracles could happen, and that bravery and faith could win out even in the face of insurmountable obstacles. In later fights, this story would boost Crusader morale. The incident was traumatizing for those who survived Saladin's troops. Many had fled in fear, saw friends and comrades being slain, and suffered the humiliation of a crushing defeat. Some might have wondered if Allah really supported their efforts and if their cause was righteous. Others, who might have been inspired by Saladin himself, might have viewed the loss as a challenge that required more commitment and improved planning in order to conquer. It's also fascinating to read about Montgisard's history and propaganda. Naturally, the fight was depicted by Crusader chroniclers as a miracle victory, evidence of divine favor.
They highlighted Baldwin's bravery, the significance of the actual crucifixion, and the righteousness of his cause. However, Muslim chroniclers faced the challenging challenge of elucidating the reasons behind the great Saladin's fall. Some minimized the catastrophe's magnitude. Others blamed betrayal by subordinates or external circumstances for the loss. The medieval era is not the only time that historical narrative has been manipulated to further political and religious goals. It continues to be a key component of how societies perceive and comprehend conflict. It's also critical to acknowledge the gaps in our understanding of Montgisard. Primary sources are few and frequently incomplete. Saladin himself did not give us any in-depth descriptions of the conflict. The majority of our knowledge is derived from Christian chroniclers who sought to exaggerate the triumph. Historians disagree over the actual battle's outcome, the particular number of troops engaged, and even the precise location of the battlefield. Regarding the degree of certainty in our historical knowledge, we must remain appropriately humble. Nevertheless, the overall plot of events is quite well established. A far bigger Muslim army under Saladin was surprised and routed by a small but elite Crusader force under the leadership of a frail but resolute young king. This improbable triumph had important historical ramifications, delaying the fall of Jerusalem and extending the existence of the Crusader powers by 10 years. By examining Montgisard from the perspective of contemporary military philosophy, we can pinpoint tactical ideas that Baldwin and his leaders either intentionally or inadvertently employed. For instance, focusing scarce resources on a single devastating hit rather than distributing them across several smaller operations served as an example of the economy of force principle.
By moving covertly and striking at an unexpected time, the principle of surprise was maximized. Baldwin's decision to attack rather than passively defend demonstrated his full adoption of the aggressive concept. Baldwin clearly maintained control over all participating forces, demonstrating the unity of command principle. In contrast, Saladin broke a number of basic military rules at Montgisard. An opposing force was able to approach undetected because he neglected to maintain proper protection. By distributing his forces instead of concentrating them, he broke the law of mass. He failed to recognize the enemy and underestimated him. When combined, these infractions set the stage for the ensuing catastrophe. The conflict also demonstrates how unpredictable war can be. Battle results can be unexpected, even with meticulous preparation, overwhelming numerical advantage, and a great leader like Saladin. Things like military morale, weather, personal mistakes, and even sheer luck can affect results in ways that are impossible to foresee. The fact that war becomes somewhat random and unpredictable once it starts is one of the reasons it should always be a last resort. When we consider Baldwin IV's personality in particular, we see a genuinely remarkable individual. By all medieval standards, this young man's condition should have caused him to be disenfranchised or removed from authority. In addition to being physically crippling, leprosy carried a great deal of social and religious disgrace. At the time, a lot of people thought the illness was God's way of punishing sin. However, Baldwin resisted letting his illness define or confine him. He led armies into war, reigned with authority, and was respected even by his adversaries. His tale demonstrates the ability of human will to triumph despite adversity. Baldwin reportedly had to be carried to the battlefield in a litter as his disease worsened in the years following Montgisard, as he was no longer able to ride a horse. Nevertheless, his troops were invigorated by his presence. A leader who serves his people despite physical limitations has a profoundly touching quality. Baldwin genuinely sacrificed everything for the kingdom he vowed to defend, including his comfort, health, and ultimately, his life.
Baldwin's relationship with the Templars likewise requires greater examination. Crucial pillars of the Crusader state's defense were the military orders, such as the Hospitallers and Templars. In a time when the majority of armies were made up of transient feudal levies, they supplied permanent, professional soldiers. The Templars had considerable financial resources, since they held large estates in both Europe and the Holy Land. They provided the Crusader state's military backbone and kept up crucial fortresses. Without them, it is questionable whether the Crusader kingdoms could have persisted as long as they did. The Templars at Montgisard proved why they were so highly esteemed. Their first assault broke enemy resistance and sparked the panic that caused Saladin's army to fall. Despite the temptation to pause for looting or to pursue specific objectives, their discipline kept the offensive moving forward. The chance of an early retreat that may have converted victory into defeat was eliminated by their determination to fight to the end. They were essentially Baldwin's primary weapon at Montgisard. Comparing the characteristics of the Muslim and Crusader armies at Montgisard is fascinating. Saladin's army was heterogeneous, comprising of contingents from different locations with varying levels of training, equipment, and enthusiasm. Even under the best of situations, coordinating such a diverse force was extremely difficult. This diversity turned into a vulnerability when shock and fear were included. The reactions of the various units varied.
Some engaged in combat, others quickly ran away, and few were able to successfully cooperate with nearby forces. Despite being far smaller, the Crusader army was more uniform. The Templars had a common tactical theory and a single command. Despite coming from various noble families, the secular knights had a similar military ethos and had frequently trained and fought alongside one another in the past. They had a strong qualitative edge due to their social and military unity, which somewhat made up for their numerical inferiority. The function of military technology at Montgisard must also be taken into account. The Crusader Knights' armor was among the most sophisticated in the Middle Ages. Excellent protection was offered by full chainmail, hefty helmets, strong shields, and occasionally metal plates added to weak spots. Particularly while mounted and in motion, their fully armed knight was practically impervious to the typical infantry weapons of the Middle Ages. When used by a knight charging at full speed, cavalry lances had tremendous penetrating force. Superior cutting force and reach were made possible by long swords. Although not total, this technological edge was unquestionably noteworthy. Additionally, training should not be undervalued. It took years of preparation, starting in childhood, to become a knight. As pages and squires, young nobility learned how to ride horses, handle weapons, conduct military operations, and uphold the chivalric code. This secular schooling was given a religious component and monastic discipline by the Templars. Elite fighters were the end product, outperforming most of their opponents in terms of both individual prowess and teamwork. Saladin's army, on the other hand, was largely composed of recently enlisted levies, peasants, and townspeople who had received little to no training. The Mamluk cavalry, one of his most seasoned units, did not always have the same degree of unity and well-coordinated training as the Templars. One of the most important factors at Montgisard was this difference in the level of individual combat. It's also important to think about the problem of pillaging and looting. Saladin's army was dispersed in part because medieval troops frequently demanded restitution in the form of loot. One way to reward and incentivize troops was to allow them to raid enemy territory. However, as Montgisard eloquently illustrated, this also produced tactical vulnerability. Baldwin gave up quick potential for material gain in favor of tactical efficiency. The battle's conclusion validated this decision.
It's all so fascinating to consider the logistical issues of the post-Montgisard recovery. In order to restore his army, Saladin had to go back to Egypt. In order to accomplish this, it was necessary to enlist more troops, train commander replacements, restock supplies and equipment, and boost confidence and morale. It's intriguing that the Crusaders did not take advantage of Saladin's fragility to strike more forcefully during the months-long process, which may have been a reflection of their own resource limitations. The triumph at Montgisard gave the Kingdom of Jerusalem a much-needed reprieve, but it did not address its underlying issues. The kingdom continued to face numerous dangers, was still outnumbered, and was still reliant on European reinforcements. Although the triumph purchased time, it had no effect on the long-term strategic dynamics that would ultimately result in Jerusalem's collapse 10 years later. It's tempting to think of other possible outcomes. What if Saladin had maintained his army's focus? What if he had set up enough reconnaissance to find Baldwin coming? What if the Crusader cavalry charge had been halted by bad weather? What would have happened if Baldwin had stayed on the defensive in Ascalon? The result could have been entirely different due to any of these circumstances. Crucial historical occasions are characterized by this attention to detail and personal choices. Centuries after the incident, Montgisard's memory endured.
he became a source of inspiration for Christian Europeans, showing them that faith and bravery could triumph over insurmountable obstacles. Baldwin was seen as a tragic hero, a good king whose life was cut short by illness, but he never let his bodily sufferings break his spirit. Montgisard was ultimately viewed by the Muslim world as a brief setback in Saladin's illustrious career, a teaching moment that improved and cautioned him as a commander. With little success, modern archaeology has tried to identify the precise location of the Battle of Montgisard. Physical remnants of medieval conflicts are rarely permanent. The bodies were either buried or allowed to decay. Temporary buildings like camps vanished rapidly, and weapons and armor were frequently gathered for later use. Ancient battles are very difficult to locate without permanent markers or distinguishing geographic features. This indicates that historical writings, rather than empirical data, account for a large portion of what we know about Montgisard. Both sides' contemporary chroniclers left behind stories of the conflict. However, they differed greatly in terms of specifics and interpretation. The preeminent Latin chronicler of the era, William of Tyre, emphasized Baldwin's religiosity and the significance of the real cross in his description of Montgisard as a heavenly miracle. Muslim chroniclers, like as Saladin's secretary, Imad al-Isfahani, admitted the loss but made an effort to minimize its importance and protect Saladin's standing. These variations serve as a reminder that every history is written from a distinct point of view and for a specific reason. It is evident from Montgisard's larger impact that a single conflict can have far-reaching effects that go beyond the actual battlefield. In addition to changing opinions about the viability of the Crusader states, the battle had an impact on Saladin's career path, diplomatic negotiations, Crusader recruitment in Europe, and the body of literature on chivalry and heroism that would shape European culture for centuries. Generations were affected by a fight that took place on a November day in 1177 and lasted only a few hours. The human cost of Montgisard must also be taken into account. Thousands of people, each with their own stories, hopes, concerns, and loved ones, were hidden behind the figures in numbers. Communities were diminished, parents were crying, and widows and orphans were left behind by the warriors who lost their lives at Montgisard. Every casualty list number represented a personal sorrow. Stories that focus on tactics and strategy frequently overlook the human aspect of battle. However, it is necessary to understand the full cost of fighting. Studying incidents like Montgisard also invariably brings up the issue of justice and morality in conflict.
The Crusaders believed they were protecting Christian lands and sacred sites from invading forces. From a Muslim point of view, they were attempting to recover territory that had been taken by foreign invaders. Both sides sincerely think that their cause was right, that God was on their side, and that their opponents were mistaken. Many religious conflicts are characterized by this mutual moral certainty, which makes peaceful resolution very challenging. Without necessarily supporting the acts of either side, we can acknowledge the moral complexity of the Crusades from a contemporary historical perspective. While lamenting the misery brought about by their conflicts, we may also respect the valor and military prowess of individuals such as Baldwin and Saladin. While acknowledging the human tragedy that the conflict symbolized, we can use the tactics and ideas used at Montgisard as military lessons.
In addition, Montgisad's research serves as a reminder of the value of historical sources and exacting technique in military history. Good historians resist the urge to simplify complicated events by crafting dramatic tales. They analyze conflicting narratives, look at a variety of sources, take authorial biases into account, and discern between credible conjecture and proven reality. This level of intellectual rigor is necessary to truly comprehend the past. As this lengthy exploration of the Battle of Montgisard draws to a close, it is worthwhile to highlight the most important lessons that may be learned from this remarkable occasion. The first is that despite their benefits, numerical superiority and material resources do not ensure victory. Quantitative disadvantages can be overcome by effective leadership, cohesive troops, superior intelligence, tactical preparation, and execution. Second, one of the most deadly threats a military leader can encounter is overconfidence. Normally careful and analytical, Saladin became comfortable with disastrous outcomes after his initial success and numerical advantage. Third, a conservative strategy would never be able to accomplish the achievements that initiative and courage, when grounded in a realistic appraisal of the circumstances, can. Fourth, in a military conflict, motivation and morale are key factors. At Montgisard, the Crusaders battled believing they were fighting for eternal causes rather than just an earthly empire. They were able to risk all against overwhelming odds because of their belief. Fifth, in addition to material and structural reasons, war is a very human phenomenon that is influenced by feelings, beliefs, interpersonal connections, and personal choices. Saladin was a human being with flaws. Baldwin was a helpless person, and their decisions affected how things turned out. Sixth, studying military history involves more than merely praising wins and exalting war. It's about comprehending how people act under tremendous pressure, how civilizations plan and use violence, how crucial decisions made by individuals can change the course of history, and how we can grow from past achievements and mistakes. All of these lessons are abundant in Montgisard. Ultimately, the Battle of Montgisard remains one of the most extraordinary examples in military history of success against seemingly impossible odds. It showed that strategic knowledge, great leadership, remarkable courage, and, yes, a little bit of luck could all come together to achieve outcomes that exceeded reasonable expectations, even in a time of harsh medieval warfare where strength frequently defined the outcome. It is a tale of people overcoming hardship, of willpower triumphing against situational forces, of will triumphing over the seemingly unavoidable. More than 800 years after what happened on that November day in 1177, Montgisard still captivates military history students, motivates those who are up against overwhelming odds, and serves as a reminder that history is not set in stone. Individual acts of bravery, decision-making, and action can have a real impact. The young leper king had no idea that his action, which pitted 500 knights against 26,000 soldiers, would be renowned for generations.
He just took the necessary actions, put everything on the line for his kingdom and his faith, and accomplished the seemingly impossible by a combination of circumstance and skill. A basic reality about the state of humanity is revealed to us as we wrap up this in-depth account of the Battle of Montgisard and its historical repercussions. We encounter obstacles that appear impenetrable, odds that appear improbable, and dire circumstances. Even under these situations, success is not necessarily impossible, as the Montgisard narrative demonstrates.
that remarkable things may occasionally be accomplished with strong leadership, meticulous preparation, brave execution, and unshakable faith. I hope this tale encourages people to value human bravery, tenacity, and excellence under duress, rather than glorifying conflict. I hope it serves as a reminder of both the horrific cost of war and the potential for success in the face of hardship. And may it inspire us to never give up on our own obstacles, no matter what. Never assume that you will lose. Never let the odds stop us from acting in accordance with our moral convictions. More than 8 centuries have passed since the Battle of Montgisard. However, its lessons are ageless. We study history for this reason: to learn from the past, not to dwell on it, to gain a deeper comprehension of who we are and the potential inherent in the human experience. The valiant Templars, the Leper King Baldwin IV, the ambitious Sultan Saladin, and the thousands of warriors who fought and lost their lives, all of them belong to our common human ancestry. Their tales are worthy of being shared, recalled, and considered. As I wrap off my in-depth examination of one of the most remarkable periods in medieval history, I want to sincerely thank the Lord God, the Creator of heaven and earth, and the fount of all knowledge and wisdom. I'm grateful for the chance to learn about and discuss these amazing periods of human history, for enabling us to learn from the past, and for helping us understand the complicated web of choices, actions, and outcomes that make up the historical narrative. May this understanding of the past help us become more shrewd, sympathetic, and conscious of our own role in influencing the future. As we pursue wisdom, knowledge, and truth in every field of human endeavor, may the Lord keep enlightening our hearts and minds. Glory and dignity, both now and in the future, belong to Him.